Some betrayals don't announce themselves with screams or shattered glass. They arrive in whispers, in the quiet moments when you're least prepared to hear them. And on what should have been the happiest night of his life, Marcus heard a whisper that would unravel everything he'd ever believed about love, family, and the people he trusted most. It was a Saturday in late September, the kind of humid evening where the air clings to your skin and makes everything feel heavy. The Renaissance Hotel on Peachtree Street was alive with celebration, 200 guests dancing and laughing 3 floors below, completely unaware that upstairs, in a dimmed hallway on the 7th floor, a man's entire world was collapsing. Marcus stood frozen outside room 712, his black tuxedo jacket hanging open, bow tie undone and dangling around his neck, staring at his trembling hands as if they belonged to someone else. Rain drummed against the hallway window with an almost rhythmic insistence, each drop seeming to count down the seconds until everything changed. Inside that room, muffled voices rose and fell, one of them unmistakably belonging to his bride of 4 hours. The other voice, low and urgent, belonged to someone he'd known his entire life. What he was about to witness wasn't meant for his eyes, wasn't meant for anyone's eyes, but destiny has a way of dragging us toward truths we'd rather never face. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now, to understand what happened in that hotel hallway, to comprehend why Marcus found himself standing there with his heart hammering against his ribs and his wedding ring feeling suddenly too tight, we need to ask ourselves some questions. Why had his bride, Aaliyah, disappeared from their reception for nearly 40 minutes, claiming she needed to fix her makeup? Why had his younger brother Derek vanished at almost the exact same moment, right after clinking champagne glasses and offering a toast that felt strangely hollow? And perhaps most troubling of all, what secret had been festering in the shadows of the Coleman family for over 2 decades, a secret so volatile that even Marcus's late mother had taken pieces of it to her grave? The answers to these questions begin not on that rainy September night, but years earlier, in a small brick house on the west side of Atlanta, where 2 boys learned that blood doesn't always guarantee loyalty, and family doesn't always mean safety. Marcus Coleman grew up as the older son, the responsible one, the boy who learned early that life wasn't going to hand him anything. His mother, Patricia, had married his stepfather Robert when Marcus was only 4 years old, too young to remember much about his biological father except for a faded photograph his mother kept hidden in her jewelry box. Robert was a stern man, a postal worker who believed in discipline, routine, and keeping emotions locked down tight where they couldn't cause trouble. He provided for the family, put food on the table, and kept the lights on, but warmth was something Marcus had to find elsewhere. 2 years after the marriage, Derek arrived, and from the moment that baby came home from the hospital, something in the household shifted in ways Marcus was too young to understand. Robert treated Derek differently, not with the favoritism you might expect for a man's biological son, but with a strange distance, as if he was fulfilling an obligation rather than raising a child he'd chosen. Patricia overcompensated, showering Derek with attention that sometimes felt desperate, as if she was trying to fill a void that shouldn't have existed in the first place. Marcus, being the older brother, naturally stepped into a protective role. He walked Derek to school, helped him with homework, stood up for him when neighborhood kids made fun of his too small clothes or his habit of disappearing into his own head for long stretches. But even as children, there was something unspoken between them, an invisible wall that Marcus couldn't quite identify. Derek was different. He had a way of watching people, studying them with dark eyes that seemed older than his years. He was charming when he wanted to be, could make their mother laugh in ways that softened the hardness in her face, but he also had a temper that would flare up without warning, leaving broken toys or holes in the drywall that Robert would silently repair without comment. As they grew into teenagers, the differences became more pronounced. Marcus took a job at a local auto shop after school, saving money for a future he could barely imagine but knew he wanted. He was steady, reliable, the kind of young man who showed up on time and kept his word. Derek, on the other hand, seemed to drift. He'd disappear for days, coming home with vague explanations about staying with friends, and their mother would simply nod, relief flooding her face that he'd returned at all. There were arguments behind closed doors, Robert's voice low and threatening, Patricia's rising in defensive panic, always about Derek, always about something Marcus wasn't supposed to know about. The pattern continued into their 20s. Marcus worked his way up, eventually buying the auto shop where he'd started as a teenager, building something real and tangible with his own hands. He dated carefully, had his heart broken once or twice, but maintained hope that the right person would come along. Derek moved in and out of their lives like a ghost, sometimes disappearing for months, returning thinner or harder or both, never quite explaining where he'd been or what he'd been doing. Their mother died when Marcus was 31, a sudden heart attack that gave them no time to prepare, no time to say the things that needed saying. On her deathbed, in those final morphine-hazed moments, she'd gripped both their hands and whispered words that haunted Marcus for years afterward. "Take care of each other," she'd said, her eyes moving between her sons with an urgency that seemed disproportionate to the simple request. "No matter what truth comes out, no matter what you learn, you're brothers. Promise me." They'd promised, of course. What else could they do? But Marcus had wondered, in the sleepless nights that followed her funeral, what truth she'd been referring to. What was there to learn that could possibly threaten their bond? Marcus met Aaliyah Richardson on a Tuesday afternoon in March, 2 years after burying his mother. She'd brought her car into his shop, a 15-year-old Honda Civic that was making a sound she described as somewhere between a dying cat and a garbage disposal. And when Marcus popped the hood and diagnosed a simple belt issue, she'd laughed with such genuine relief that something in his chest had loosened. She was beautiful in an understated way, with natural hair she wore in different styles, warm brown skin, and eyes that held both sadness and hope in equal measure. They started with coffee, then dinner, then weekend trips to the mountains where they'd talk for hours about everything and nothing. Aaliyah worked as a social worker for the county, spending her days navigating bureaucracy to help children in foster care, and Marcus admired her dedication even as he noticed the way certain cases would leave her hollow-eyed and quiet for days. She'd grown up in Macon, she told him, raised by her grandmother after her parents proved incapable of the job. There were pieces of her past she didn't like to discuss, shadows that would sometimes cross her face when certain topics came up, but Marcus respected her boundaries. Everyone had things they'd rather forget. What mattered was who they were choosing to become together. Derek met Aaliyah 6 months into their relationship, during a Sunday dinner at the family house that Robert still maintained alone. Marcus had been nervous about the introduction, uncertain how his unpredictable brother would respond to this woman who was becoming increasingly important to him. But Derek had been charming that evening, funny and attentive in ways that reminded Marcus of their childhood, before the distance and disappearances. He'd asked Aaliyah about her work, seemed genuinely interested in her answers, and by the end of the night, Marcus had felt a cautious optimism that maybe his family could come together around this relationship. But he'd noticed something, a moment so brief he'd almost convinced himself he'd imagined it. When Aaliyah first walked into the house and saw Derek standing in the kitchen, her face had gone pale, just for a second, and her hand had tightened around Marcus's with what felt like fear. Then the moment passed, she smiled, and everything seemed normal again. Marcus filed it away as nervousness about meeting his family, but in hindsight, it was the first crack in a foundation he didn't know was already damaged. The proposal happened on a beach in Savannah, sunset painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that looked too perfect to be real, and when Aaliyah said yes through happy tears, Marcus felt like his life was finally clicking into place. The planning took 8 months, and through it all, Aaliyah seemed both excited and anxious in ways that Marcus attributed to normal wedding stress. She'd have moments where she'd go quiet, staring at her phone with an expression he couldn't quite read, but when he'd ask if everything was okay, she'd smile and change the subject. Derek had offered to help with wedding preparations, surprisingly engaged in a way he rarely was with family events. He'd shown up to the venue walkthrough, offered opinions on the seating chart, even volunteered to pick up the groomsmen's tuxedos when the shop called to say they were ready. Marcus was touched by the involvement, saw it as evidence that his brother was finally growing up, finally becoming the family man their mother had hoped he'd be. But there were odd moments that didn't quite add up. One evening, Marcus had stopped by the house early to surprise Aaliyah with dinner, using the key she'd given him, and found her sitting on the couch with her phone pressed to her ear, tears streaming down her face. She'd hung up quickly when she heard him come in, claimed it was just stress about her grandmother's declining health, but the look in her eyes had been closer to panic than grief. Another time, 2 weeks before the wedding, Marcus had walked into a restaurant to meet Aaliyah for lunch and spotted her at a back table with Derek, their heads close together in intense conversation. When they noticed him approaching, they both sat back quickly, smiles appearing on their faces like masks being put in place, and Derek had explained they were discussing a surprise for Marcus, nothing to worry about. Trust, Marcus had reminded himself. Relationships were built on trust. And he did trust Aaliyah. He trusted Derek. They were his family. The rehearsal dinner went smoothly, 50 of their closest friends and relatives gathering at a restaurant downtown, toasting the couple and sharing embarrassing stories that made everyone laugh. Marcus's father gave a short speech about commitment and patience, his eyes lingering on Derek for just a moment longer than seemed necessary. Aaliyah's grandmother, frail but determined, held Aaliyah's hand and told her to always tell the truth, no matter how hard it seemed, because secrets had a way of growing teeth. At the time, Marcus had thought it was just old person wisdom, the kind of generic advice elderly relatives felt obligated to dispense. He didn't know it was a warning. September 21st dawned humid and overcast, the kind of day where the clouds hung low and threatened rain that wouldn't actually fall until evening. Marcus woke up in his apartment feeling nervous in the good way, the anticipatory flutter that came with standing on the edge of something new and important. His groomsmen arrived by 10, filling the space with laughter and the kind of jokes men tell when they're trying to mask sentimentality, and by noon they were at the church, adjusting bow ties and cufflinks while Marcus tried to calm his breathing. The ceremony itself was beautiful. Aaliyah walked down the aisle in a dress that made her look like something out of a dream, ivory lace and silk that caught the light filtering through the stained glass windows, and when she reached Marcus at the altar, her hands were shaking so badly he had to steady them with his own. The pastor led them through the vows, traditional words about love and honor and commitment, and Marcus meant every syllable. When they kissed, the church erupted in applause, and for those few seconds, everything felt perfect. The reception at the Renaissance Hotel started at 6, cocktail hour flowing into dinner as the DJ kept the energy high and guests rotated through the dance floor. Marcus's face hurt from smiling, from accepting congratulations and posing for photographs, but it was the good kind of hurt, the evidence of joy. Aaliyah seemed more relaxed than she'd been in weeks, laughing at jokes and dancing with her bridesmaids, and Marcus let himself believe that whatever stress had been weighing on her was finally lifting. Derek gave a toast at 8:30, standing at the microphone with a champagne glass and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He talked about brotherhood, about watching Marcus grow into a man worth admiring, about welcoming Aaliyah into the family. The words were right, but something in the delivery felt hollow, rehearsed rather than heartfelt, and when Derek raised his glass for the final toast, Marcus noticed his hand was trembling. At 9:15, Aaliyah excused herself from their table, leaning in to whisper that she needed to touch up her makeup. The humidity was doing terrible things to her foundation. Marcus kissed her cheek and told her to take her time, turned back to a conversation with one of his groomsmen about fantasy football. 5 minutes later, he noticed Derek was gone too, his chair at the family table empty, his jacket still draped over the back. 10 minutes passed. Then 15. Marcus felt the first flutter of unease, told himself he was being paranoid, but couldn't quite shake the feeling that something was off. He checked his phone, no messages from Aaliyah. He scanned the ballroom, couldn't spot her among the clusters of dancing guests or the groups gathered around the bar. At the 20-minute mark, he stood up, told his best man he was going to check on his bride, tried to make his voice sound casual even as his pulse started to quicken. The hotel was a maze of hallways and conference rooms, and Marcus checked the women's restroom on the second floor first, calling Aaliyah's name and getting no response. He tried calling her phone, heard it ring somewhere in her purse back at their table. He checked the lobby, the hotel bar, the outdoor patio where a few guests had gathered to smoke. Nothing. A strange certainty was settling over him now, cold and heavy in his stomach. He needed to find Aaliyah. He needed to find Derek. And he needed to do it now. The elevator to the 7th floor seemed to take forever, and Marcus couldn't have explained why he'd chosen that floor, what instinct was guiding him away from the celebration and toward whatever waited in the quiet hallways of guest rooms. When the doors opened, The contrast was jarring. The muted carpet, the soft lighting, the silence broken only by the sound of rain that had finally started, tapping against windows at the end of the hall. Marcus walked slowly, checking his phone again even though he knew Aaliyah didn't have hers, trying to think of reasonable explanations for why both his wife and his brother had disappeared at the same time. And then he heard it. A voice, female, coming from behind a door that was cracked open about 2 inches. Room 712. The voice was Aaliyah's, but distorted somehow, thick with emotion Marcus couldn't immediately identify. He moved closer, each step feeling like it took an hour, and through the gap in the door he could see movement, shadows against the warm light of the room's lamps. "Stop," Aaliyah was saying. "Please, this has to stop. I can't do this anymore." Another voice responded, male and familiar, and Marcus's heart dropped into his stomach. "Derek, you don't have a choice," Derek said, his voice cold in a way Marcus had never heard before. "You think you can just walk away? You think he deserves to not know the truth?" Marcus's hand moved to push the door open before his brain fully processed what he was doing. The scene that revealed itself was worse than any nightmare his imagination could have conjured, not because of what was happening physically, but because of what it represented. Aaliyah was standing near the window, still in her wedding dress, her face streaked with tears and mascara. Derek was across the room, fully clothed but with his shirt partially unbuttoned, holding what looked like photographs in his hand. They both froze when Marcus entered, 3 people caught in a moment that would define all their futures. The photographs fell from Derek's hand, scattering across the floor like leaves, and Marcus saw flashes of images he didn't understand. The silence stretched, broken only by Aaliyah's sharp intake of breath. "Marcus," she whispered, and the devastation in her voice was so complete that for a moment he almost turned around, almost walked away to preserve whatever innocence he could still claim. But he didn't. Marcus looked at his brother, at this person he'd protected and defended and loved despite everything, and asked the only question that mattered in that moment. "What is this? What the hell is this?" Derek spoke first, his voice taking on a defensive edge that Marcus recognized from every argument they'd ever had as children. "It's not what you think, brother. I was trying to protect you." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow, the sheer audacity of them, the suggestion that this scene, whatever it was, had been orchestrated for his benefit. He turned to Aaliyah, saw her reaching toward him, and took a step back. "Don't," he said, and the word came out harder than he'd intended. "Just don't." Aaliyah's hand dropped. She looked at Derek with something that might have been hatred or might have been fear. Marcus couldn't tell anymore. Couldn't trust his ability to read the people he'd thought he knew. "Tell him," she said to Derek, her voice gaining strength. "If you care about him at all, if any of what you've said about brotherhood means anything, tell him the truth." Derek's face went through a series of expressions, defiance shifting to calculation, shifting to something that looked almost like shame, and Marcus realized with a cold certainty that there was more to this story, layers he hadn't begun to uncover. Marcus heard footsteps in the hallway, his father's voice calling his name, the concern evident even from a distance. Robert must have noticed them missing, must have come searching, and now he appeared in the doorway, taking in the scene with eyes that went wide with recognition and something else, something that looked like old grief. "No," Robert said, just that one word, and it contained years of history Marcus didn't understand. "Not like this. This isn't how this was supposed to happen." Marcus turned to his father, felt the room tilting around him. "You know about this? Whatever this is, you already know." Robert's silence was answer enough. The betrayal compounded, multiplied, and Marcus felt something fundamental breaking inside his chest. He walked out of the room without another word, leaving all of them behind, the sound of rain and his own ragged breathing filling his ears. He made it to the stairwell before his legs gave out, and he sat on the concrete steps with his head in his hands, his wedding ring catching the fluorescent light, trying to understand how his life had become unrecognizable in the space of 10 minutes. If you're still watching, comment "I'm still watching." Because what happens next, the truth that finally comes to light, is something Marcus never could have prepared for. The pieces of this puzzle have been scattered across years, hidden in plain sight, and now they're finally coming together into a picture that will change everything he thought he knew about his family, his marriage, and the woman he'd just vowed to spend his life with. Marcus didn't return to the reception. He couldn't face the guests, couldn't put on a mask of happiness when his entire world had just shattered. Instead, he drove, aimlessly at first through rain-slicked Atlanta streets, until he found himself pulling into the driveway of his childhood home. The house was dark, Robert still at the hotel presumably trying to manage the situation, and Marcus let himself in with a key he'd never given back. The house smelled the same as it always had, furniture polish and the faint ghost of his mother's perfume. And standing in the living room where he'd spent countless evenings doing homework and watching television, Marcus felt 15 years old again, small and powerless and confused. But he wasn't 15 anymore. He was a grown man who'd just been betrayed by the people he trusted most, and he deserved answers. His mother's belongings were still boxed up in the attic, items Robert had never been able to sort through, photographs and letters, and the accumulated debris of a life cut short. Marcus climbed the stairs, pulled down the attic ladder, and started searching with no clear idea what he was looking for, operating purely on instinct. It took him 40 minutes to find the shoebox hidden under winter coats, and when he opened it, the contents hit him like a physical force. Letters, dozens of them, in his mother's handwriting and others he didn't recognize. Legal documents with names redacted. A birth certificate that made his breath catch. And photographs, so many photographs, of his mother when she was young, barely more than a teenager, holding a baby that wasn't Marcus. The dates on the back of the photos predated his own birth by 3 years. Marcus spread the documents across the attic floor, his hands shaking as he tried to piece together the story they told. His mother had gotten pregnant at 19, before she met Robert, before she became the woman Marcus remembered. The father of that baby was someone named James Mitchell, and according to a letter Marcus found from a lawyer, James had signed away all parental rights when the baby was 6 months old. The baby's name, at least initially, had been James Mitchell Jr., but there were other documents. Papers showing a name change when that baby was 2 years old, adoption papers signed by Robert Coleman despite the fact that he and Patricia weren't married yet, weren't even engaged. The new name was Derek Robert Coleman. Marcus sat back against a dusty box, the pieces finally clicking into place. Derek wasn't his brother, not in the way he'd always understood it. Derek was his mother's first son, born from a relationship that had ended badly, adopted by Robert as a condition of marrying Patricia. That's why Robert had always treated Derek differently, with distance instead of affection, obligation instead of love. He'd agreed to raise another man's child to get the woman he wanted, and apparently that resentment had never fully faded. But that wasn't all the box contained. There were more recent letters, printed emails actually, dated from just 2 years ago, after Patricia's death. They were addressed to Robert, sent from an email address that included the name Mitchell. James Mitchell, Derek's biological father, had resurfaced. The emails told a story of a man who'd spent decades regretting his decision to abandon his son, who'd tracked down Patricia only to discover she'd died months earlier, and who was now demanding to meet Derek, to establish some kind of relationship with the son he'd given up. Robert's responses, printed and filed carefully, were cold and clear. Derek knew nothing about his origins, and never would. As far as Robert was concerned, the past was buried with Patricia, and James Mitchell needed to disappear back into whatever life he'd built and leave the Coleman family alone. But there was another set of documents, these ones making Marcus's blood run cold. Private investigator reports, hired by someone to research Aaliyah Richardson's background, dated from 3 months before Marcus had proposed. The reports were detailed and invasive, listing addresses where she'd lived, jobs she'd held, and buried in the middle, a section about an incident from 6 years ago when Aaliyah had been 23. She'd been involved in a relationship with a man named David Mitchell. The relationship had ended badly when Aaliyah discovered David was married, and she'd filed a complaint with his employer that cost him his job. David Mitchell was James Mitchell's nephew. The connection was tenuous, but there, a thread linking Marcus's family to Aaliyah's past in ways that seemed too coincidental to be random. And according to the investigator's notes, someone had contacted Aaliyah 4 months before the wedding, someone who knew about her connection to the Mitchell family and had information they claimed she'd want to keep quiet. The investigator couldn't confirm who had made contact, but they noted that Aaliyah had seemed frightened when questioned about it, had paid the investigator's fee in cash, and asked for all copies of the report. Marcus's phone buzzed, breaking his concentration. A text from Derek. We need to talk. I need to explain. Not on the phone. Meet me at the warehouse. Marcus stared at the message, then at the documents surrounding him, and made a decision. He needed to hear this directly. Needed to understand what web he'd been caught in and who'd been pulling the strings. He gathered the most important documents, stuffed them in his jacket, and headed back out into the rain. The warehouse was one of the buildings Marcus's auto shop owned, a space they used for storage and occasionally for working on project cars that needed more room. Derek was sitting on a workbench when Marcus arrived, the overhead lights casting harsh shadows across his face. And for the first time, Marcus could see the resemblance to the young man in those old photographs, the baby his mother had held with such tender desperation. I know, Marcus said before Derek could speak. I know you're not really my brother. Not biologically. Derek's face crumpled, years of pretense falling away. Mom told you? No. Marcus pulled out the documents. She died keeping your secret. But she left evidence, maybe hoping someone would find it. Maybe just unable to completely let go of the truth. Derek slid off the workbench, paced across the concrete floor. Robert hated me, he said, his voice raw. Every day of my life, I could feel it. He fed me, put a roof over my head. But he hated me for being another man's son, for being the price he had to pay to marry my mother. And she loved me too much, tried to make up for his coldness, which just made everything worse. Marcus wanted to feel sympathy, but the anger was too fresh. What does any of that have to do with Aaliyah? What the hell happened in that hotel room? Derek stopped pacing, his back to Marcus. 6 months ago, a man contacted me. Said his name was James Mitchell, and he was my real father. At first I didn't believe him. Thought it was some kind of scam, but he had proof. Birth certificate, photos, letters from my mother. He'd been trying to reach me for years, but Robert had blocked him at every turn. Marcus felt cold certainty settling in. And what did he want from you? He said he just wanted to know me, to be part of my life. And maybe that was true at first. But then he found out I had a brother who was getting married, and he did some research on your fiancée. Aaliyah, Derek continued, turning to face Marcus with eyes red from tears he was trying not to shed. She had a past with his nephew David. It ended badly. David told James stories, made her sound like some kind of manipulative person who'd ruined his life, and James decided you needed to know the truth before you made a mistake. So he reached out to her, told her if she went through with the wedding, he'd make sure you found out about David, about the details she'd never told you. Details that weren't actually true, but that she thought you'd believe. Marcus processed this, felt the architecture of his understanding shifting. So tonight, the hotel room. Derek's face twisted with something between guilt and defiance. I told her I could fix it. I'd been meeting with James, trying to talk him out of this revenge plan he didn't even understand he was acting out. I thought if I could get Aaliyah to give me something, anything that proved she wasn't the person David claimed she was, I could convince James to back off. But she was terrified, crying, saying she couldn't lose you over lies about her past. That's what you walked in on, me trying to get her to tell me something I could use to protect both of you. Marcus sat on the cold concrete, his legs suddenly unable to support him. So Aaliyah wasn't cheating. She was being blackmailed, and you were trying to help her. Derek nodded, sat down across from him. I know how it looked. I know what you must have thought. But Marcus, I swear on Mom's memory, nothing happened between us. I was trying to be your brother, actually be your brother for once in my life, and I screwed it up. The anger Marcus had been carrying started to crack, making room for a more complicated emotion. And all this time, you never told me about James Mitchell, about finding your real father. I didn't know how, Derek said simply. How do you tell someone that the family you both believed in was built on secrets and conditional love? How do you admit that you spent your whole life feeling like an outsider in your own home, and now you know why? Marcus thought about all the years, all the moments when Derek had seemed different or distant, and recontextualized them through this new information. The boy who disappeared for months at a time was looking for belonging. The anger that would flare up without warning was rage at an injustice he couldn't even name. The charm that felt manipulative was actually armor, protection against rejection. Did Aaliyah know? About you and James Mitchell? Not until tonight, Derek said. I had to tell her why James was targeting her, that it wasn't really about her at all. It was about him trying to connect with me by destroying something that belonged to the family who'd kept him away. Sick logic, but that's what grief and rejection do to people. They sat in silence for a long moment, the rain drumming on the warehouse roof. Where is she now? Marcus finally asked. At her grandmother's, Derek said. I called her a car, told her to go somewhere safe. She's been texting me every 10 minutes asking if you're okay, if you'll talk to her. Marcus pulled out his phone, saw 17 missed calls from Aaliyah, text messages that progressed from apologetic to desperate to resigned. The most recent one, sent just 5 minutes ago, said simply I love you and I understand if you need me to leave. I'm sorry, I wasn't strong enough to tell you the truth from the beginning. Marcus showed the message to Derek. What truth didn't she tell me? Derek hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. The thing with David Mitchell, it wasn't just a relationship that ended badly. He assaulted her. When she reported it, his family called her a liar, said she was trying to ruin him because he'd ended things. His employer did their own investigation and fired him, but his family never believed he was guilty. That's why when James Mitchell contacted her, she panicked. She thought he was going to make you believe the same lies, make you think she was the kind of person who'd falsely accuse someone. The final piece clicked into place, and Marcus felt his heart break for an entirely different reason. She thought I wouldn't believe her. She thought I'd choose his version over hers. Derek met his eyes. That's what trauma does, Marcus. It makes you believe you're not worth defending. Marcus found Aaliyah sitting on her grandmother's porch in the early morning hours, still wearing her wedding dress, now wrinkled and rain-spotted, looking like a ghost of the happy bride from just hours earlier. She stood when she saw him approaching, wrapped her arms around herself as if she was cold despite the humid night. I'm so sorry, she started, but Marcus shook his head. I'm the one who should apologize, he said, for not being the kind of person you felt safe telling. For not making it clear that nothing from your past could change how I see you. She started crying then, the kind of tears that came from months of carrying weight alone. He told me if I married you, he'd tell you I was a liar, that I destroyed his nephew's life for attention. And I couldn't bear the thought of you looking at me the way David's family did, like I was someone capable of that kind of cruelty. Marcus stepped closer, took her hands. Tell me now. Tell me all of it. And she did. There on that porch as the sun started to rise, the full story of David Mitchell, and what he'd done, and how she'd fought to be believed, and eventually given up fighting, because it was easier to just move forward than to keep defending herself. She told him about the panic attacks she'd had when James Mitchell first made contact, about the impossible position she'd been in, choosing between protecting her future with Marcus and protecting herself from accusations she couldn't defend against. When she finished, Marcus pulled her close. I believe you, he said. Without question, without doubt, I believe you. They talked until her grandmother came out with coffee and gently suggested they might want to change clothes and rest before making any big decisions. And Marcus realized with a jolt that they were married, legally bound, and yet they'd spent their wedding night apart and in crisis. He turned to Aaliyah. I need time to process all of this, he said honestly. Not time away from you, but time to understand how we move forward from here. Because we are moving forward, if that's what you want. She nodded, relief and exhaustion making her sway slightly. That's what I want. More than anything. Over the following weeks, Marcus worked to understand the fuller picture of his family's dysfunction. He met with James Mitchell, a meeting that was awkward and painful and necessary, where an aging man tried to explain why he'd given up his son 40 years earlier and why he'd handled his return so catastrophically. James had been 18 when Derek was born, terrified and pressured by his own family to walk away. And he'd spent decades convincing himself it was the right decision until it became the weight he couldn't carry anymore. His approach to Aaliyah had been misguided, an attempt to protect Marcus from what his nephew had convinced him was a dangerous person, and when he finally understood the truth, the genuine remorse in his eyes was undeniable. Marcus also confronted Robert, his stepfather, in a conversation that was long overdue. Why did you treat him like that? Marcus asked. He was a child. He was innocent in all of this. Robert, for the first time in Marcus's memory, broke down. I was jealous, he admitted. Jealous of a dead man's hold on your mother's heart. Jealous that she loved Derek with a fiercer protectiveness than she ever showed you, because she felt she had to make up for my coldness. I was wrong. I let my pride and my insecurity poison a child's life, and I don't know how to make amends for that. Derek started therapy, began the hard work of unpacking trauma that had been compressing for decades, and slowly started to build a relationship with James that was cautious but genuine. Marcus watched his brother, the person he'd always tried to protect, finally start to protect himself, setting boundaries, and asking for what he needed instead of disappearing when things got hard. One evening, 3 months after the wedding that had ended in crisis, Derek came to Marcus's house for dinner. Aaliyah cooked, the three of them sitting around a table that felt both familiar and entirely new. And Derek said something that Marcus would remember for the rest of his life. "I spent so many years being angry at a situation I couldn't control that I became the problem myself. I hurt people because I was hurting. But that stops now. I'm choosing differently." Marcus reached across the table, gripped his brother's hand. "We're both choosing differently. We're choosing truth, even when it's uncomfortable. Even when it means admitting we were wrong." Aaliyah added quietly, "We're choosing to believe that people can heal if they're given the space and support to do it." It wasn't a perfect resolution because real life doesn't offer those. There were still hard days when old wounds ached, still moments when trust felt fragile and required conscious effort to maintain. But they were building something real, something that could withstand the weight of truth, because it was founded on truth rather than the pretty lies families often tell themselves to keep the peace. Marcus and Aaliyah didn't retake their vows or have another wedding ceremony. Instead, they marked their actual anniversary 6 months later with a quiet dinner at the restaurant where they'd had their first date, and Marcus gave her a gift that had taken him weeks to create. It was a photo album, but not of their wedding day. It was filled with images from the months after, moments they'd chosen to stay and fight for each other, pictures of hard conversations and small victories, and the slow reconstruction of trust. On the first page, he'd written words that had come to him one sleepless night. "Some love is easy, arrives fully formed, and asks for nothing. But the love that matters, the love that changes you, that's the love you build in the wreckage of everything you thought you knew. That's the love that teaches you who you really are." Aaliyah cried when she read it. Not the desperate tears of their wedding night, but the kind that came from being truly seen and accepted. "This is us," she said, touching the pages. "This is our real story, not the fairy tale version." Marcus nodded. "And I wouldn't change it. Because this version, the messy and complicated version, is the one where we chose each other with full knowledge of the cost." Derek's healing journey continued, sometimes 2 steps forward and 1 step back, but always in the direction of growth. He eventually started speaking at support groups for adoptees and people dealing with family secrets, sharing his story in hopes it might help someone else feel less alone. Robert attended one of these talks, sitting in the back of the room with tears streaming down his face, and afterward he approached his son, the son he'd legally claimed but emotionally rejected, and said the words that should have been spoken 30 years earlier. "I'm sorry. I failed you. And if you'll let me, I'd like to try to do better." It wasn't a magical fix, wasn't a moment where all the hurt disappeared, but it was a beginning. James Mitchell remained a peripheral presence, careful not to push too hard, grateful for whatever relationship Derek was willing to offer. They met for coffee once a month, awkward conversations that slowly became easier, and Marcus sometimes joined them, finding it strange but meaningful to watch his brother connect with the man who'd given him life even if he hadn't raised him. What Marcus learned through all of this, what kept him awake some nights turning over in his mind, was that the people who hurt us are often the ones carrying the deepest wounds themselves. Derek's behavior throughout their lives hadn't been random cruelty or inexplicable distance. It had been the survival mechanism of a child who'd felt unwanted, who'd internalized the message that he was a burden to be tolerated rather than a son to be loved. Robert's coldness hadn't been about Derek at all, not really, but about Robert's own inadequacy, his jealousy of a ghost, his inability to separate his wife's past from his present. And Aaliyah's inability to trust Marcus with her trauma hadn't been a failing of their relationship, but evidence of how thoroughly David Mitchell and his family had succeeded in making her believe she was unreliable, that her truth was negotiable. These realizations didn't excuse the pain everyone had caused each other, but they created space for understanding, for compassion, for the possibility of something different. Marcus started to see his family not as the simple categories he'd assigned them, good or bad, reliable or unpredictable, but as complex human beings doing their best with the tools they'd been given, sometimes succeeding and sometimes failing spectacularly. He also confronted his own role in the family's dysfunction. He'd been so committed to being the stable one, the responsible one, that he'd never questioned the foundation that stability was built on. He'd accepted Robert's distance toward Derek as just how things were, never pushing for explanation or advocating for change. He'd seen Aaliyah's anxiety about her past and chosen to respect her privacy rather than creating explicit safety for her to share. Good intentions, but incomplete action. 1 year after their chaotic wedding night, Marcus and Aaliyah hosted Thanksgiving dinner at their house. It was a small gathering, just Robert, Derek, James, and Aaliyah's grandmother, but it felt monumental in its ordinariness. They ate too much, argued good-naturedly about football, and shared stories that were slowly knitting together a new narrative about who they were as a family. At one point, Aaliyah's grandmother raised her glass and offered a toast that made everyone go quiet. To the courage it takes to tell the truth, and to the love it takes to hear it. They drank to that. These people who'd been strangers and enemies and family, sometimes all at once, who'd chosen to stay in the hard work of relationship rather than walking away when it got complicated. And Marcus thought about his mother, about the secrets she'd carried to protect them all, and wondered if she'd known that someday the truth would come out, that her sons would have to face what she'd hidden and decide whether it would destroy them or make them stronger. He liked to believe she'd had faith in them, faith that love, real love, the kind that survives revelation and crisis, would be enough to see them through. Late that night, after everyone had gone home and Marcus was washing dishes while Aaliyah dried, she asked him a question that had clearly been on her mind. Do you ever wish we could go back to before that night, when things seemed simpler? Marcus considered this, watching soap bubbles swirl down the drain. Sometimes, he admitted. But then I remember that the simplicity was an illusion. We weren't happier before, we just knew less. And now that we know the truth, all of it, we have the chance to build something real instead of something pretty. She leaned against him, rested her head on his shoulder. I love you more now than I did on our wedding day. He kissed the top of her head. Because you know all my broken pieces and you stayed. Because I know yours and I'm staying too. That's what real love is. It's not the absence of problems. It's the commitment to working through them together. They finished the dishes in comfortable silence, and Marcus thought about all the ways this story could have ended. Divorce, estrangement, years of bitterness and blame. But instead, they'd chosen something harder and infinitely more valuable. They'd chosen to stay, to forgive, to understand, and to grow. The story of Marcus and Aaliyah's wedding night became something they rarely talked about with others, but never forgot themselves. It was the night everything fell apart. Yes, but it was also the night that made everything that came after possible. The night that taught them love isn't about perfection. It's about presence. It's about showing up even when it's hard, especially when it's hard, and choosing each other again and again and again. Derek eventually moved to a different city for a fresh start, but he called Marcus every Sunday without fail, conversations that sometimes lasted 5 minutes and sometimes stretched to an hour, and the consistency of it meant more than the content. Robert, in his 70s now, started therapy of his own, working to understand the patterns he'd perpetuated and make what amends he could in the time he had left. And James, the ghost who'd haunted their family for decades, became a real person, flawed and regretful, but trying, always trying to be better than he'd been. The Mitchell family drama, the blackmail attempt, the investigation into Aaliyah's past, all of it resolved in ways that were more anticlimactic than dramatic. James apologized directly to Aaliyah, expressing genuine horror at what his misguided attempt at protection had nearly cost. David Mitchell, confronted with the possibility of Marcus pressing charges for harassment and stalking, disappeared back into whatever life he'd built, and they never heard from him again. So what would you have done in Marcus's place? If you'd walked into that hotel room and seen your world falling apart, would you have had the strength to listen, to investigate, to push past the initial pain toward understanding? And what about Aaliyah's position, trapped between trauma from her past and fear for her future? Could you have found the courage to speak truth to the person you loved most, even if that truth might have cost you everything? These aren't easy questions. Real life rarely offers clear heroes and villains, right choices and wrong choices. More often, it gives us complicated people in impossible situations, doing their best with incomplete information and old wounds that haven't healed. But here's what Marcus would tell you if he could speak directly to you now, and what he told me when I interviewed him for this story. The truth will always find a way out. You can bury it, hide it, lock it in boxes in your attic, but eventually it will surface. And when it does, you have a choice. You can let it destroy what you've built, or you can use it as a foundation to build something stronger, something real, something that can survive the weight of honesty. Is love powerful enough to survive truth? Yes, but only if both people are brave enough to face that truth together, to stop protecting each other from reality, and start supporting each other through it. Marcus and Aaliyah are still married. Still working on it every day. Still choosing each other, now with eyes wide open. Their story didn't end on that rainy September night in a hotel hallway. It began there. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think about your own relationships, your own family secrets, your own capacity for forgiveness and growth, let us know in the comments. Tell us where you're watching from and what part of this story hit you hardest. And if you think someone in your life needs to hear this story, someone who's dealing with family dysfunction or betrayal or the long road of rebuilding trust, share it with them. Sometimes we need to know we're not alone in the mess. Subscribe for more stories like this, stories that don't shy away from the complexity of being human, stories that remind us that healing is possible even when it seems impossible, and that the love worth having is the love that survives being tested. Until next time, remember that your story isn't over, no matter how broken it feels right now. The end isn't written until you decide it is, and sometimes the best chapters come after everything falls apart, because that's when you finally have the freedom to rebuild it right.